Good day, everyone. I'm Xanda Hilger, and I coordinate the North Central Texas Teleconnection. A little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. Family diplomacy. This was a topic that the speaker had recommended, and I thought, excellent term for the members of the team that work with an older adult, and how caregivers do have to be ambassadors to each other and sometimes to the world at large. So let me introduce GJ. GJ Hodson has spent their early 30s as a 24/7 family caregiver for an adoptive grandfather with dementia. And he is in North Central Texas also. When their grandfather could no longer live at home, GJ oversaw his memory care stay while attending graduate school. Many of those of us who've had our care receivers in a facility know that sometimes the hardest part of our caregiver journey can start when they go to a facility, because we're overseeing a lot of activities we no longer have the control of that we did when we lived with them. So that said, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you very much for joining us. And I want you, please, if you would you please tell us a little bit more about your background? Would rather hear it in your words. I have a lot of information that you provided me, but I really would like to hear what you have to say for us. And look at that bright, colorful slide. Over to you.
Thank you. Now, do you see my presenter view or do you just see the slide?
I just see the slide.
Okay, excellent. Well, Xanda, thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here. I want to thank y'all for having me and the WellMed Foundation for having me again. I was able to have a great conversation with Elliot Sklar and Lucy Barilak about aging in LGBTQ communities last year. So it's a pleasure to return. I also want to tell you about what brought me to this topic. So you know what I'm about to share comes from experience, not just some books I read. When I was 31 years old, my adoptive grandfather was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease while recovering from pneumonia in a hospital in California. Before I'd even gotten him home in North Texas, I knew that I would become his caregiver, especially after I'd seen him care for his wife, my adoptive grandmother, only a few years earlier. My experience as his solo, cohabiting, chosen family caregiver changed everything in my life, but there was nowhere else I could imagine being. We lived at home for 4 years, and I had already lived here since my grandmother had passed away. And then I oversaw his time in memory care for another 15 months. I had a handful of friends who would visit, who texted, who would come over and keep me company. And I got to know Ed better than I ever thought possible. That was his name, Ed. But it was also a very isolating and exhausting and expensive time. Since I'm a person who uses knowledge and information to heal, I enrolled in graduate school so I could learn how to research caregivers and interpret my experience with national trends. I also started volunteering, first as a support group facilitator, and later as a community educator and mentor to other misfit caregivers. So I have 6 years of experience as a facilitator under my belt as well. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit of my own experience as well as stuff that I've learned from talking with dozens and dozens of others who've gone through my support groups over the years. And again, this continues to be a personal topic because for a couple of years, one of my support groups included my mother-in-law, who we lost to COVID last year. And so you could say I care a lot about caring. I took an interest in this topic in particular, family diplomacy, because my family of origin, or FAMO, as I like to call them, were not very involved in helping me with Ed. Ed had been in my life my whole life. We sort of had this adoptive relationship from my birth, but the other members of my family who were also close to him just didn't participate in his care anywhere near the same level. And I felt abandoned, like I could not put into words. Over the years, I've known a lot of other caregivers who struggled with family members who weren't supportive. Individual experiences will be very different, but I'm hoping to take some of what I've learned along the way, help you see your situation for what it is, and make whatever adjustments you'll need. And one final note, most of these slides just synthesize what I'm saying. So I want to keep it simple. So folks joining by phone or just listening are able to participate fully. So caregivers are diplomats? I want to acknowledge that today's topic should apply to most care situations, but it seems to be especially relevant, and in my own personal experience was most relevant, where the person who receives care is not fully able to participate in decisions about their own health, such as dementia or other cognitive conditions, such as psychological or behavioral conditions, such as someone with developmental impairments. So when I say family diplomacy, what do I mean? Well, I mean caregivers are like ambassadors or diplomats. On top of handling whatever day-to-day needs our loved one may have, we are usually left with the responsibility of coordinating and communicating between a lot of important people. If people in your care team, family, friends, neighbors, anyone who might want an update on how your loved one is doing, if y'all are close, you may have to work around their existing relationships so you don't step on someone's toes and cause an international incident or the caregiver equivalent. And if they're not close to each other, you may become the one who does all of the communication between them. I'm going to talk today about a care team like an embassy, an office for high-level dignitaries with important responsibilities. I hope it goes without saying that the person who is affected by a condition should otherwise be the decision maker for their own health, wherever possible. Think of the care recipient as the president overseeing your office. Maybe they're hands-on and maybe they're not, but your job as care diplomat is to keep the president safe and healthy, to follow their wishes whenever reasonable, and to generally make them look good. From there, it helps, as this meme says, to develop an outward support system. The person or persons who provide the most care and decision-making make up the first layer, the chief ambassador. Anyone else who is directly involved in care or decision-making make up the next ring, the kind of the mid-level diplomats. And then anyone who supports the caregivers more than the care recipient, or who only come around once in a while and they're not involved in decision-making, they're kind of an outer ring, the support staff or the diplomats from some other embassy, or sometimes they're not even on the staff, but they're people writing angry letters from home without really understanding what you're dealing with. As we move forward on this topic, I want you to keep in mind caregiving is a journey, and you may not get to pick your roles or your companions. So if caregivers are diplomats, what are their responsibilities? Well, for one, they coordinate and communicate between a lot of people with a lot of responsibility. Let's think for a moment about all of the different facets of communication and coordination a caregiver near the center might be dealing with. They're looking out for their care partner's best interests. Sometimes that includes fighting with the care partner when their past wishes and current wishes don't match up. So you have to learn how to prioritize that. Which decision was made in the right mindset, and which one do you have to be a little more skeptical of? The diplomat, the primary caregiver, the main person at the center there, they're also talking to family, they're talking to neighbors, they're talking to people on Facebook, they're talking to people from your faith community, if you have one, strangers on the street. Any interaction that has to do with your loved one may become, in part or in whole, the caregiver's responsibility. They're working with not only doctors and nurses, but also health insurance and Medicaid and in-home health care. They're working with financial institutions and individuals representing them. And anytime there's paperwork involved, they may have to hire a lawyer and a notary. They have to keep documentation to prove they're spending money appropriately. So much paperwork, so much record keeping. They may need to call the police and warn them and say, my loved one has dementia, or my loved one hallucinates, or my loved one sometimes yells for no reason, or my loved one sometimes wanders. And I want to make sure y'all have it on record that they're not a threat. To be clear, these are responsibilities that someone is likely to have to fulfill. So let's get away from metaphors and explain some of the real words and ideas today. First, if you don't know, caregiver is kind of a controversial word. It's often confused for caretaker, which is really more for taking care of a building or a property. But a lot of people don't like that there should be a word at all. Some people don't want a title or a name for it. They just think of caregiving as a duty, a family responsibility. If you call someone a caregiver, they might fight you. To get around this, a lot of surveys don't ask, are you a caregiver? They all ask, do you help someone out? Are you involved in someone's day-to-day needs? Many languages outside of English don't even have a word yet. Does anyone know other words for caregivers that I haven't already mentioned? I'd also love to hear words for caregivers in other languages, because from my understanding, there aren't that many. So if you know another word for caregiver, pop it in the chat and let me know. Although I realize with this setup, I'm not going to be able to look at the chat until we're done. But I'm going to look forward to reading those later. I did recently learn that cuidador is finally catching on in Spanish, but it has taken years for that word to catch on. Cuidador is the Spanish equivalent of carer, which for some reason is preferred in the United Kingdom. We've also been talking a lot more in research and in services like this about the partnership, the relationship between a caregiver, usually the main caregiver, and the recipient, the care recipient. They're both care partners because the care should happen as a partnership. Each person has needs and contributions, even when those contributions may be limited by illness or injury. Another term we use in research a lot that doesn't always translate outside of academia is informal versus formal care. The idea when these terms came about was that informal was when someone wasn't paid. They probably have no medical training. They're just stepping up for a loved one. Whereas formal care is when you hire someone through a home health agency or something like that. But I find that the line gets blurry pretty fast. What if you live in a state that pays or provides insurance to family caregivers? What if you have a relative who lives with you and cares for you while providing room, while you provide room and board? It's hardly minimum wage, but it is something. That was my situation, by the way. I don't think I could have worked and taken care of my grandfather at the same time. So I was living here room and board. I lived cheap, but you know, he was paying my way while he was alive. Primary and secondary caregiver are also used a lot to refer to whether a specific caregiver is the number one or the lead provider of support or decision-making. But you can also split responsibilities. You may have more than one primary caregiver, and then secondary would be, you know, those other folks who are less involved. Activities of daily living refer to the daily functions, eat, drink, go to the bathroom, get dressed, stuff like that. Instrumental ADLs refer to the functions that you need to exist in society. You need transportation, you need to pay your bills, you probably need prescriptions to get picked up and managed. All of these things weigh into the caregiver experience, and all of them can be broken down if needed as different responsibilities that can be shared by a care team, or they can often do fall to one person to handle all of them. And of course, again, I want to reiterate, we've got our president of our embassy, we've got our care recipient. When you're not talking about dementia, when you're talking about physical limitations, when you're talking about a fatigue or pain condition, that person is still going to be able to be involved. They're going to be the primary decision maker above all else. So that care partnership continues. I'm not going to say too much about care burden or caring versus caregiving, but I want to tell you something that I bet you didn't know. Next of kin is a term that is only really used in the United States for everyone for legal matters. Other countries might have something similar that they use for royal bloodlines or very specific situations, but otherwise they just trust communities to sort it out. We're the only ones who have laws that say first the spouse and then the children and then the cousin or the sibling or there are laws that spell this out, and we are the only country that has them, and I think that's really fascinating. In the USA, the only way to avoid next of kin processes is by creating other legal documents that supersede them, and we'll talk about those a little bit more later. Okay, one more introductory slide, and then we're going to really dive in. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. When I start reading academic literature about caregivers, when I started reading literature about caregivers, I was surprised to find that no one can agree on how we define who a caregiver is. One study will include adults, while another will only include children with certain conditions. One will include temporary ailments like a broken arm or pneumonia, but others will only count care that lasts longer than 6 months. Most of them say dementia is pretty much the hardest situation. I've been working on something. I don't think it's ready for academic journals yet, but I've been trying to think of what qualities would help us to recognize a type of caregiver very quickly. Obviously, the condition matters. Whatever the ailment, the illness, the injury, the state of being that is existing for the care recipient, that is going to set the terms of care, right? What needs exist, what ADLs, what IADLs will need support. But the challenge is that some of these terms, some of those conditions don't mean the same thing to everybody, or a person can have multiple conditions, and people can have different needs based on the stage of some conditions. So how do you convey that? I think when we're talking about types of caregiver, we need to be able to break it down even simpler. And the two questions that I narrow it down to are questions about the care that's involved and questions about the relationship between the care partners. So like I mentioned, scope of recovery, duration of recovery. What do I mean by that? I mean, is the condition temporary? Are they expected to make a full recovery or only a partial one? Is the condition progressive, meaning it gets worse over time? Alzheimer's disease and most dementias are progressive. Is it terminal, meaning that it is expected to cause death somewhere down the line? And one of the conditions that we just don't know is cancer. Some types of cancer are more deadly than others, but we have so many treatments. It's no longer an automatic assumption of whether, if someone has cancer, the next question is it terminal, or how bad is it? Is it the bad kind of cancer? So these questions again dictate, and with cancer, you may not always have the answer to that question right away. So these are the kinds of questions that will determine the scope of care. They weigh heavily on the caregiver, the greater support system, and of course, the person with the condition themselves. So what do I mean by relationship details? Well, I like to break it down by generation within a family. I think we first think of spouse or partner, and partners do perform over 10% of all care in the United States. But sometimes, especially when we're looking at older folks, the spouse may not themselves be in a position to be able to provide much care. They have their own health stuff going on, or they're just not strong enough, or something's going on, and they might be involved. They might be participating in decision making at some degree, but they may not be able to be the primary caregiver. If the spouse is physically incapable but mentally sharp, they're still going to want to have a say in how everything goes. One thing that I think is really cool in LGBTQ plus communities, you often see ex-partners who take part, because if you're chosen family, you stay chosen family. And I really admire that. I really appreciate that in my community. And then sometimes you're looking at younger generations taking care of older generations. Adult children, especially daughters and daughters-in-law, do about 50% of care in the United States, more than every other relative combined. Younger and more diverse generations, such as millennials and Zoomers, who, yes, the oldest Zoomers are already well into their 20s. They are more likely to care equally between men and women than older generations. And in Hispanic families, sons tend to care more often than daughters. And then youngest adults, those who are like 18 to 25, usually a child or a grandchild, can face some of the biggest obstacles because they have very little life experience caring for anybody beside themselves. And they may not have a stable career yet. They may not have stable housing yet. So what responsibilities they take on, they're really starting from scratch. They have a lot of physical and mental resilience, and they may be able to learn quickly, but it's a further climb for them. Minors, so anyone under the age of 18 who do also participate in caregiving, sometimes even as a primary caregiver, they're less than ideal as primary caregivers because they lack legal standing, but they may be the person who's the most available, or they may be the only person available. They may have the flexibility they need to offer and get social and logistical support. It's important to include minors in decision-making commensurate to the responsibilities that are being asked of them. The more responsibility you're putting on them, the more you're also giving them a right to have a say in how it goes. And they need to be a full participant at the level that is being asked of them. And it's important to also point out this. Here's one of our little diplomacy tricks. Parents of minors do not automatically get an extra voice by proxy. Let the minor speak for themselves. When a spouse or an adult child is not available, other relatives do sometimes step in, cousins, nieces, nephews, but none of these care as much as non-relatives. One thing we haven't been able to capture yet in the research is step families. We are well into the age when families have been experiencing second, third, fourth marriages, having children with multiple families over the years. And at some point, you got to coordinate these folks together in a shared interest. There's no research on it yet. And there's very little programming out there. So that's a place where this negotiation, this diplomacy is going to be front and center, beginning to end. Because with step families, a person who is related by marriage may not have that next of kin status that I talked about earlier. They may not have rights afforded by next of kin, but they may still be affected. They may still be involved in those changes. And then, navigating step families is just its own thing. I want to see more on this. We are also seeing close friends who provide care. And sometimes when someone lives alone and they don't have any known family, a neighbor or an acquaintance will step up. And their neighbors and acquaintances usually don't step up as much. They're going to have a difficult time getting involved with personal care acts. They're not going to be involved in medicine and medical tasks, but they're going to check on the person. They're going to bring them some food. They're going to ask if they need a ride to the doctor. And those people can be primary caregivers in some amazing ways. And we always appreciate their generosity. So now that we have a better sense of who might be caring, let's talk about the qualities we want to watch for when building our care team. There's a list here, and I'll read it real fast, but I want you to think about what isn't shown on this list. Feel free to leave some ideas in the chat. So under important, I've got consistency, living nearby, negotiation skills, skill sets that are relevant. It's easy to overlook the first few when you focus only on the skill sets. So I recommend kind of going in this order. Don't just start with the skill set. Oh, so-and-so is a nurse. Obviously, they're going to do all the medical stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're consistent, live nearby, or have good negotiation skills with the rest of the family. Under not important, I think we need to set aside some of the things that we sometimes let become important, but they kind of get in the way. So things like status within the family, or how much wealth someone has, or just how busy they are. We sometimes defer to that as a leadership quality when it may not be relevant at all to providing good care. We also think about how close a particular person was with the care recipient. It can be an asset, but if these other qualities don't align, you don't want to designate, oh, well, you know, so-and-so was the closest daughter and she lives 8 states over, but we're going to name her the primary caregiver, even though 3 other people live closer. That probably doesn't make sense. It pains me to say this because, oh, I lost my place, sorry. In general, it doesn't matter whether the care partners agree on these things, so long as, yes, sorry, I was talking about I did lose my place. Conversational disagreements. Yes, that's where I was. In general, it doesn't matter whether the care partners agree on things like politics or what terminology you even use to describe the condition that is being dealt with. And it pains me to say that because my values are very important to me. And I think that's true for a lot of people. I would rather have a caregiver who keeps bad politics to themselves than someone who gets everyone riled up over something like sports or picking a restaurant. Context. Can they perform the duties of care without being disruptive? If they can, that's a bigger asset. If we don't like their values, if we think they've made some poor choices, is that important? Can they step up in these other ways and keep that stuff outside of the room? Then it's not going to be an issue. Just don't forget, once again, that the people at the center of care have the most say about what is or is not disruptive. So again, if Cousin Joe doesn't think that these politics are disruptive, but that every time that person enters a room, they're starting arguments with everybody else, that's disruptive. That's just not helpful. So I asked y'all to think about what wasn't on this list. Xanda, did anybody come up with anything?
Not yet.
All right. So these are all individual traits, but what matters most is that the care team, whether it's 2 people or 20, are all on the same page and work together well. Unfortunately, it's such a distinct situation, you may not find out until you're already well into the process how well you work together as this kind of team. Being a family does not necessarily train you to be project managers for this level of care and responsibility. The stress of caregiving will also change people individually. It'll change relationships between people on the care team and even between caregivers and the person being cared for. Over time, the stress can change families. The primary caregiver is at their most diplomatic when they can help other team members find compromises and stay in service to the care recipient. Everyone working together toward a collective goal. Most of us will not have anyone else to do this, so it falls to the primary caregiver. If you've got a diplomat in your family, assign them to help coordinate the communication and the decision making. If you've got a facilitator, use them. Since our topic today is family diplomacy, I'm going to kind of assume the folks here have family who may or may not be involved in caring for someone else, but are at least theoretically available. For that reason, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on solo caregivers. I just want to, mention that being a solo caregiver doesn't mean being alone for the care journey. Just because no one else is participating in that care of your care partner, it doesn't mean that there aren't other people looking out for you. In fact, that's one of the things that I encourage in care teams is if you need to break it down, who is caring for the person, the care recipient, the person at the center, your president of your care embassy, and who is caring for the diplomat, who is caring for the primary caregiver, because it's okay to separate those roles. Some people may be able to do both, but some people, maybe they're more your support than they are your loved one's support. That's important too. And so for solo caregivers, that's where you absolutely have to have that support. Maybe there isn't another single caregiver in your life. Maybe no one else is participating in the ways that you are with your loved one, but you've got to have people to talk to. You've got to have people to ask questions. You've got to have people to help you unwind. So for the rest of us, it's time to look at roles and responsibilities, the many hats that we wear as caregivers. If we have an active, engaged care team, we should be able to share some of these responsibilities. Powers of attorney. These are powers granted by legal contract that's saying that if someone is incapacitated or cannot make decisions for themselves, this is the person who should make those decisions instead. This is one of those documents that if you don't have it, it falls to next of kin. And I don't know if you've heard about these nightmare stories, but next of kin can get complicated really quickly. If you have a widower who has 8 children and no power of attorney, a hospital may want you to get the consent of every one of those 8 children before they will do anything, before they will perform any intensive medical care. So that's a worst case scenario, but this applies at all levels of intensity. In most states, there are several documents. There's several types of powers of attorney. So a solo caregiver might have all of them, or a care team might split them across 2 or 3 or more people. You might have one person with medical power of attorney and someone else with financial power of attorney. Medical power of attorney is obviously decisions about health and medicine, financial decisions about money and property. I do want to point out, this is something we sometimes don't think about because we forget to think about the future. Since power of attorney ends with the person's death, someone who is supported by the care recipient's finances may need savings to get them by while a will is being probated, etc. Ask me how I know. And then many states now have a mental health power of attorney. This is one I don't know about as much, so I don't want to say too much on it. I'm skimming this in general because there are a lot of resources out there that will tell you about these documents. I want you to know these documents exist and why they're important, and then go talk to a lawyer and find out which ones are appropriate for your family. It's important to have the documents in place before a crisis, though. That's the challenge. Is being prescient, is seeing the future and having it in place before you need it. In fact, I am going to mention, though, that North Central Texas Area Agency on Aging has done some terrific webinars over the past couple of years, and I believe they still are, about legal documentation. So if you get a chance, check them out. And one more note on legal documents before I move on. You may be surprised at who wants to see documentation and who does not. Many hospitals have their own policies, and some of them, they'll barely give you a Band-Aid without seeing a power of attorney, and others will just take your word for it. I was surprised at the places that would ask me for my power of attorney and the ones that wouldn't. So that it's kind of better to be prepared in all situations. So your first act as diplomat is to build your embassy. Social support should meet the needs of care partners. Oh, I was looking at the wrong slide. Personal assignments. I got ahead of myself. Social support should meet the needs of care partners. Each care partner must have someone to talk to about what they are going through who is not the other person. Even in the case of dementia or cognitive or behavioral conditions, it's good for the care recipient to have somewhere that they can vent, or somewhere that they can think out loud, or somewhere that they can just talk and feel heard. And so if you have a friend who's maybe, or if they have a friend who's maybe outside of the care team, but is a good listener, make sure that there's time for that person to come around. It may just be, every few months, or it could be every day if needed. It just depends on your situation. But it's really important that even if the person is, even if cognition is not an issue, even if the person is 100% fully aware and participating in their care decisions, they're still going to need somebody to talk to who isn't their care partner. And you are going to need someone to talk to who isn't your care partner. So keep that in mind. I like to break it down as the kind of the levels of social support. And this applies for both care partners. Is this person going to be a confidant, meaning that they can tell their deepest secrets, they can have long conversations and stay entertained? Is it company, someone who sits beside and just watches TV, brings around some food, hangs out, no pressure, or a sitter? And this is in the case of maybe a person with dementia who wanders. A sitter is literally someone who just sits there, maybe reading a book, maybe watching TV. They may not even socially engage very much with the person, but they're just there to kind of keep an eye out, so that if the person tries to get out of bed when they're not supposed to get out of bed, or starts to show signs that they're going to get up and leave the house, their job is to just let caregivers know. Because you can't imagine how much reprieve it is to just be able to take an hour or two to not be listening to every room in the house, to every door in the house, to keeping an eye on cameras or on windows, to make sure that the person is where you think they are. If you can hire or pay a cousin or someone, a young person who just needs a little extra income, to just sit and keep an eye out, and they don't have to participate in any of the care responsibilities, just notify you. Logistical support can be most easily distributed to others. So social support, you need to decide what level of relationship there, and that relationship has to exist, or it has to be cultivated. Logistical support, pretty much anybody can step into this, and it can be just a tiny little thing at a time. Food, transportation, shopping, errands. Make us some food, make us a meal, pick up some groceries for us, do a little research. I just heard about this area agency on aging, and I want to know if I qualify for any of their services. Could you help me find the website and maybe get some preliminary information, maybe order me some brochures, or, even research them yourself and come back and just tell me the 30-second version of what I'm looking for, what information I need. Communication. This is where I really first started to think about caregivers as diplomats, because we often have such a responsibility to communicate how our loved one is doing with so many other people. We don't think anymore about things like phone trees, but phone trees were how the PTA used to stay in touch before emails and texts. You would assign, each person has 1 or 2 or 3 people that they call, and then each of those people has 1 or 2 or 3 people that they call. And that way word can get out quickly about updates without burdening that one person who's at the top of the phone tree, because they've got stuff to do. Beware, and this isn't to say don't do it, but just beware of the limitations of relying on Facebook or other social media. Social media relies on getting our attention. A lot of the times the pages refresh faster than we can keep up with everything. And you have to learn how the individual app or program or site works if you want to keep up with everything. Things may be happening that just disappear off of your feed before you even know that they're there. So you've got to make sure that it's not your only resource. I recommend a good group chat, but you may have to have different levels. Like, here's the 20 relatives who need to know how the person's health is doing, but here's the 3 people who need to know when we're meeting with the lawyer, kind of a thing. It's important to have a backup plan. Contingencies. What happens if you get sick? What happens if you get injured? Do you have a backup caregiver who can step in and isn't already themselves stretched to the gills in whatever role they're already participating? And if you have a backup caregiver, are they backup serving for you, or are they also going to support you while you are sick or injured? Because if you're going to need someone to look after you, you might need two caregivers. You might be in one of those temporary caregiver situations. Who's going to do that? Because it's going to be really hard to find someone who can do both. And I mentioned research. Another project to research, and this is a good one to hand off to other people. Tell me what I need and help me get it together. An emergency bag. Get together copies of your documents, change of clothes, list of medications. This is an important one. Everybody needs it at some point or another. It's just good to plan ahead. Again, you hate to only think about it once you actually need it. Okay, now your first act as diplomat is building your embassy. You want to take stock of who's available and how they are available. Kind of start thinking in terms of weekly. Who is available to come by every week? Who is available to come by more often than that? Who's available to come by less often than that? What responsibilities can be split or combined or shared? You want to match the needs, the responsibility with the roles. Start with, minimum contributions, not maximum. If somebody comes to you and says, oh, I could give, between 5 and 20 hours a week supporting your care system, start with the 5, maybe even start with 3. Like you want to start with low expectations and build up, because you don't want a crisis to develop when someone isn't able to meet that commitment the first time. And also think about who can specialize and who can do a little bit of everything. The roles, they can be broken down however you choose. That's the freedom of being the diplomat, of being at the center of the care team. One question, and this will vary widely from family, that's why I'm not any more specific. Do you need a clear chain of command? If your family has a specific patriarch or matriarch, and there's a very clear, like, if they're not available, this is the decision maker, and if they're not available, this is the decision maker, you may have to work with the family to figure out where the care chain of command is. Because if you're not that matriarch or patriarch, there may be some tensions between these different responsibilities, and it's really vital that you sort that out before there's a problem. Everyone needs to be on the same page. Again, that's the goal. You may also have to think about helping others feel like they matter, but not getting in your way. Do you need to give someone a ceremonial responsibility that isn't very important to you, but might be important to them? Again, the goal is to minimize power struggles. It's okay if you start this process late. If you're 6 months or 2 years or 6 years into caregiving and you're like, oh, I've never thought about it this way, start now. It's okay. It's also okay if you have to make changes over time. It's not like you one and done. You cannot just assign one team and stick with it forever. Roles change over time, and you should let them. As the lead diplomat, you may have to help others communicate better with each other as well as with you. As much as it matters when roles are first selected, it will come up again and again in waves. People may be surprised that their strengths or endurance are not what they expected. That goes both ways. It could be that they're not as strong in something as they thought they'd be, or they might find out that they're surprisingly good at something that they didn't think they would be. Account for life changes. Try not to wait for someone to come to you and ask for more or less responsibility as their life changes change their availability. It's not fair, but this is your responsibility, is to make sure that everything runs smoothly, right? Preventing disagreements. Try to look for agreements instead of expectations. So when you don't state something clearly, it's an expectation. When there's something in your head that, well, obviously everyone knows that Granny doesn't eat tomatoes, so don't ever buy her food with tomatoes. You cannot take that for granted. You put that out there, put that information out there, and confirm with people that they have it. Technology can help with this. You can create a Google document or a Facebook group or some repository of information somewhere that everyone has access to. Just make sure that they all know how to navigate it. Because when we're working intergenerationally, not everyone is going to have the same tech skills and the same tech preferences. Got to factor that in too. It's all part of the diplomacy. You're going to need mediation strategies. Remember to talk about facts, not feelings. I noticed that, or it seemed when, trying to talk about the details that you notice rather than your feel. Before you talk about your feelings, you can say, I noticed this thing that happened and it made me, and I felt sad afterward, or I felt confused or whatever, but the facts need to come first. Beware of pre-existing hierarchies and unrealistic expectations, or unrealistic intentions. Sometimes people will overcommit, or just say that, you know, they're gonna do all the things, and that may not be coming from a place of self-awareness. Unfortunately, again, this falls to us as diplomats to recognize. I don't want to spend a lot of time filling your head with stereotypes and guesses about what you should do in response to specific personalities, but I will tell you there are a few patterns which I will describe below, but the best places to learn how to work with and around family members are within the family. Who gets along with everyone? What's the secret? What's their secret? How can they help you? Go to some support groups. You'll be surprised how often these types of personalities recur over several families. Go to therapy. Did you know that therapists can specialize in working with caregivers and former caregivers? If you know anyone who's ever been a caregiver, even if the experience was widely different, the condition, the age, whatever, there's a solidarity that we can find with each other that may help us feel seen and heard faster. We're also great at brainstorming creative solutions. Okay, archetypes really fast. Hierarchical is when someone just wants to be in charge and they feel like they have to have a final say in everything. You may have to figure out whether it's better to give them a little bit of responsibility or to stand up to them and say, this is my responsibility and I need you to butt out. Hopefully you can find a more diplomatic way to do that. Some people are over-involved or over-committed. You may have a younger person who just has that kind of codependency that they just need to be needed. They're figuring out their role and they're trying to volunteer for things they're not really qualified to do, or just trying to fill time and be seen by everyone else. And it's important to help them to have healthy boundaries and, you know, by all means utilize their availability, but make sure that they're taking some time for themselves too. Under-involved. Some people are just like, oh yeah, I'm going to be there. I'm going to be there. I'm going to get involved. And they just continually don't show up. It's important to get concrete details. When someone says, I am going to, say, okay, what time can I expect you? Do you need a call? Can we get that in writing? You know, whatever it takes. If they've been checked out for a while, it's better. This is a hard one, but it's better to just not wait for them. Don't hold the door open for them. If they catch up, they catch up. Some people, especially if they're not involved in the day-to-day, will be hypercritical. They just think everything you're doing is wrong. They nitpick. They do a ton of research without really researching the right things, and have a criticism. And with these folks, this is the hardest situation sometimes, because often what they're dealing with is their own guilt at not being more involved or not being able to have things done the right way. But you kind of have to ask them to put up or shut up, or you may have to set boundaries around how much contact they have with you. Sometimes they can even be disruptive with your care partner, where they're poisoning them against you, or just complaining so much that the person starts to question you, and you have to shut that down. You have to get ahead of that. It's very difficult to navigate. Again, support groups are a great place to process this and get some creative ideas based on your specific situation. And then, other diplomats. One of the hardest situations to read are people in your social support who are themselves on their own caregiving journey. This happened to me once, and I later found out that the person distanced herself from me because she felt like I had a lot more advantages in my care situation, and she had a hard time not resenting me for it. We were able to talk about it later, but it was interesting. It was a change in our relationship. I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So I'm going to kind of skim through these last few slides. Caregiver relationships could be its own presentation. The main thing I want to say here is do not, under any circumstance, assume that a romantic partner can or will shoulder any of your care journey without an explicit conversation. Talk, ask, discuss, negotiate. Don't just say, oh, well, I've got to go do this thing, so you've got to make lunch. If you have already negotiated that in advance, that when you're unavailable, they're going to make lunch, that's one thing. But if that conversation has not taken place, you are taking your partner for granted. Especially if it's a newer relationship, you know. On the topic of taking care of oneself, there's challenges. Your mentality is going to make a difference in how your loved one, their health outcomes. And it's not really about like positive vibes. It's about, do I, as the caregiver, feel supported? Do I feel competent? Do I have the resources that I need and information? Do I know how and whom to ask for help? There are positive and negative aspects to caregiving, and we need to be honest about both. We may need to find a way to see the positive sometimes, but it's there, I promise you. And accept that caregiving changes you. And I think letting ourselves be changed by caregiving is one of the things that will help us be more sustainable, to help us with our self-care, is seeing ourselves as, is caregiver my role at this time? Is this who I am? That identification can make it easier. You're not so resistant to, oh, I got to go to the doctor again today. It's like, okay, here's our responsibilities today. Is it my job? Is it my calling? Is it my, that responsibility? Once you have taken it, you need to internalize it somewhat. Anyone providing care needs their own support system, whether they only provide a few hours or of support a week, or they're involved 24/7. Self-care is a much bigger concept than you may realize. It's about a lot more than bubble baths. It's about survival. The term self-care originated with trauma response personnel combating burnout, and then it gained prominence as part of Black activism in the 1970s. And I think some of the concepts there, they didn't call it self-care, but I think that existed even before then, because it's kind of a political act. It says that my strength is good for my community and my cause. People who devote their lives to helping others have realized that they must put some of that effort into personal sustainability for that work to continue. Intentional practices that strengthen the mind, body, and spirit will allow the work to continue. There's a lot of workshops and resources out there. Highly recommend checking them out. Again, therapy and support groups can be really good for talking about self-care. And just keep in mind that you have a life outside of care. If you're dealing with someone who is older, who has a terminal condition, dementia is a terminal condition, who has a progressive dementia, progressive condition, you have to keep in mind that you may have a life after care. And it's actually a worst case scenario if you don't. There is a small, but not like way too high portion of caregivers who pass away before the rest of the family even really knows how sick the loved one is. I've actually known it personally to happen to people I knew 3 times. And so we've got to practice that self-care. And part of that is letting everybody know what's happening and letting everybody participate, asking for help, accepting it when it's available. Supporting your self-care is all about delegation and learning to offer and accept help. I start small. I recommend whenever someone comes up to you and says, is there anything I can do? Have a list of tiny items that you just need off of your to-do list. Test them. If you're like, oh, I need milk, and the person doesn't come through, you're not out 12 hours of time, but not to count on that person. But if that happens, sorry, I didn't mean to advance that. if that happens and they do it well, you're like, okay, maybe next time I can ask them to do a whole grocery run for me. You can build from it. And remind yourself that no one does it alone. That's the whole point of being a diplomat, right? No one is doing this alone. Last thought, caregiving changes families. The success or failure of the family care journey, meaning that have we given as much as we could in a way that sustains us all, will come down to your care team's openness and collaboration. It probably won't be fair, so don't fixate on that. Again, that's where good therapy may come in. There's a saying, people go to therapy to learn how to deal with people who won't go to therapy. But it's not, and that's not about complaining or blaming everything on your parents. It's about having someone who can help you see the big picture and process it without erasing your own needs. It's okay to need help wrapping your brain around it all. As hard as it can be, caregiving can make your family stronger. And so this is me. Thanks,
Okay,
Sandra, for
good.
having me out. Do we have some questions?
Good. A couple of comments. I have put in a lot of resources in the chat, including links to our website, which has links to the Texas Statutory Powers of Attorney. We always recommend an attorney, ways that you can find an attorney that is lower cost, perhaps. I have listed the resources of the Elder Care Locator, the Dialing 211, the Area Agency on Aging that you mentioned. I also, on our website, there is a blog. And by the way, a blog, GJ has done a really outstanding blog for us. And I'm trying to find out when that will be posted. And I will send that to Minerva so she can send it along to you. But on our website, I found a blog, How to Create a Caregiver Duty List, which refers to what you were talking about. In our website, just do a search for anything, how to, self-care. There's lots of different resources, frequently asked questions that might be helpful for you. I also included more on GJ that I asked from him, and you can take a look at that. I've had a lot of comments about how good the information. Comment that I want to make, I think the idea of an embassy and ambassador is an excellent metaphor. One question I wanted to ask, and then I'm not seeing a whole lot of questions, but someone said realistic, rational, objective, applicable, extremely concrete, and user-friendly were the comments about that. The question I had, I was surprised when you said in the Hispanic community, the majority were sons. That was very surprising to me. Do you have information about how many, is there a percentage of those that are caring for males versus females?
There is information, but I don't remember it off the top of my head. I do think that there's a high mortality rate in Hispanic populations that factors in. So older people are overwhelmingly, more than other populations, tend to be women.
Mm-hmm. Right. And
so I think the question there, it really comes down to demographics. It may not be a true trend.
Mm-hmm. And generational too. I'm sure it makes a big difference, whether it's first, second, third generation.
Yes.
Questions, either on chat or to ask directly. A wealth of information. And there was a comment, will you get those of you that are on with us? Yes, you'll receive a PDF from Caregiver Teleconnection with this slideshow. Let's see, great information, helpful, not getting as many questions. Maybe everyone's still absorbing all those questions. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this is 443 area code. My question is, you were saying to get together to have the conversation how do you initiate the conversation for deciding about caregiving, or see who is willing to be a caregiver? Because I have 3 children, and I think my middle child is out of the picture. She just decided that I couldn't live with her automatically, which was surprising because she's my best opportunity in terms of living close. So now, how do I have the conversation with my other 2 daughters to see how we're going to work it? Because one is out of town, and then the one is here, is the youngest child, which is to me the most immature. But I'm not saying, when I say that, I'm just saying in terms of maturity, she's developing herself. Don't get me wrong, she's moving
Less
on to the next
experienced.
thing. Right,
Yeah.
less experience. That's a good word.
I follow you.
But
I follow you.
since you made that mention, I'm considering having to sit down with her about what I need, because I just finished caregiving for my spouse, who unfortunately has passed, and we had each other's back. But now it's me, and ain't nobody. We haven't had a discussion about who gonna have my back. So,
and you probably wore yourself out, didn't you?
I really paced myself because I had the caregiver telethon. We have a healthy aging group, and so I always had a background to help me to pace myself. But even in my husband's illness, he really took care of me also.
Yeah, I got you. And so some of that responsibility, you need more help.
Right, but I'm just saying I could have used more help, and I should have delegated better, but the circumstances were what they were, and I did fairly well because I tried to balance myself. It was challenging, but it wasn't as challenging because he was very helpful and willing and did whatever he needed to do, and we always communicated. There was nothing wrong with his mental capacity.
Yes.
So we could figure out what it was. He made his decision. We already talked about it, how we're going to do it, what we're going to do, what he didn't want, what he did want. And the children went along. There was no problem. But I'm just saying at this point, now I'm feeling kind of by myself.
I understand.
Because your biggest thought is always how to stay safe. Just because I'm able to function, but I'm saying if something should happen and I'm not able to do that, who is going to do all the things that I do? Because they really don't know about them. I'm telling them about the life insurance and the what you call them, but you know how your children want to turn around and they want to oh, we can't talk about it. We can't do that. But I need to have that conversation with my child since you mentioned it. And I want to know, how do I start that? To ask her, do I do suggestions or scenarios that what might happen? Would you be able to do this for mommy? Would you be willing to do this for mommy? What do I do?
I mean, I think it helps just to plan out different scenarios and to be open to different possibilities. It sounds like you've already been trying to have that conversation one-on-one with some of those folks, and maybe the results aren't quite consistent. So if it gets to the point where it's clear that you can't just talk about it one-to-one, because at some point everybody's got to be in the conversation, right? And if somebody's long distance, you may have to do this on a phone call or a Zoom call. What's the best way to get everybody talking at the same time? You want to try to prepare them that, listen, we need to have a conversation about grief, about changes in our family, about I'm getting older. You may not even say that, like, you may not even start with immediately, there are things that my husband provided, and my condolences, by the way, that I was able to get support when he was alive that now I can't, and I need help. You may not even have to start with that. Just start with, let's make some space to grieve together. Let's acknowledge how much change has happened in our family just in a few short years, and talk about how we feel about that, and talk about what we're afraid of for the future. That's the tricky part, is get people to acknowledge what their real fears are. Because once they're out there, it's so much less scary. It's so much less intimidating and overwhelming. And you may be able to provide support for each other in ways that you didn't know you could, because you didn't know that, you know, some offhand comment 5 years ago, or the way that, you know, the way that I hold my kitchen, or, you know, whatever little tiny detail it is that means nothing to you is a huge deal to someone else. And you have to talk openly about it. You got to find a way to support each other through that.
Can I offer what I put into chat that may help?
Sure.
Family Caregiver Alliance in California was one of the first that focused on this. I've included a link to holding a family meeting, which is what we always recommend is important. If you need a mediator, that's great. Do you see
good.
that?
I
Okay.
don't see it. I don't think it went to everyone.
Okay, well, it says everyone and everyone directly. So I don't know what's going on with that.
Well, you can put it in the email. She's on the phone too, so she wouldn't see it on chat.
Right. But go online, just do those simple words, but anybody will suggest get everybody together, hold a family meeting, and list out those needs that you have. As GJ has already talked about, there's also a list to difficult conversations. I'm not sure why you're not seeing that, because I included, I responded to one of the participants, but I will include those, and Minerva can, because I think that's something that probably a lot of people that are listening in,
Yeah.
your comments are certainly well taken, and this may be helpful too.
And the other thing I would say is to try to, sometimes people are just intimidated by the idea of a family meeting. So if you can make it a party too, if you know, make it a family get together, have some food, you know, let's have a potluck. Let's have a conversation. If that doesn't work, you may have to trick people and just be like, okay, we're gonna have a big picnic, and not tell them that the reason for the picnic is that we all got to sit down and have this conversation.
And you know, you made such a good comment. The importance of the
space.
And you made such a good comment, ma'am, about safety. You're wanting to stay safe. That right there, there's a lot in it for your family of your staying safe.
Yes, and not just
think about my thing about safety is when you traverse through the world now, there's so many things that you got to worry about. As in, people are not obeying the laws and doing things. So I have to plot out how I want to, like getting to the grocery store, let's say. It's not that big a deal, or the bank. But getting there, which routes am I going to take? Because they have so many problems with accidents at these places. Because that's, you know, we ain't talking about just getting sick from being sick. You could have something else happen. So I want to traverse from my house to wherever I'm going and get back safely. Consciously, I think about it because that's important, you know, to my being able to continue to be you know, self-sufficient.
Absolutely.
Because anything can happen any day, and it's you have to think about it more now because things have changed so much. You don't ask people; you got to figure out whom you're going to ask for help. If you need directions, if you need anyone, you used to walk up to somebody. You don't do that no more because you have to be very careful who you are asking for directions and different things. People try to take advantage of you or you whatever. You know, where I park my car. All those kinds of things. That's the safety thing I'm saying for each of us that we have to do in addition to staying
absolutely, but also your safety at home. Okay, we're coming up on almost 1 or 15 minutes after the hour, so perhaps we should wind down. I'm going to send the links. I don't know why, because Zoom is telling me that it's chatting with everybody, anybody and everybody, but if there's a way, GJ, that you could summarize what you want to make sure that folks realize from today's your talk today. Is there closing comments you would like to make?
I think just being open. I congratulate you, if no one else has, for being there for someone you care about. And that level of compassion is actually really difficult to live out. I think a lot of people say that family matters to them, or that community members matters to them, or their friendships matter to them. And very few people will actually accept the call when the need arises. So first of all, if nobody else has congratulated you on having a big heart, to everyone who is here, I will congratulate you on that. And I will say
Absolutely.
that there are more opportunities than you can possibly imagine to share that responsibility, but you have to have difficult conversations to get there. And this is going to go back to the caller's point or questions. If you, I totally spaced out there.
There's so many thoughts you have.
I have so many thoughts. That you, yes, this is you want to have the difficult conversations before a crisis happens. That is the most important thing. And you can use that for rhetoric. You can say it to the people you need to have the conversations with. You want to say, listen, it's not even necessarily that I know for certain that I need this today, or that my loved one is going to need this today, that so-and-so is going to need this today. It's that they're going to need it someday, and I don't know what day that is. And you probably don't either. So let's be prepared, because the conversations are way less scarier if you build them up gradually than if you're having them in a hospital, in the emergency room, in the ICU, in the middle of a crisis.
Mhm. Excellent. Thank you so much. I think we could, I think everybody could agree this topic could go on and on and on, because it's so crucial to good care for the care recipient and such an impact on families. And so I hope everybody has taken this to heart. Where is your embassy, and how large is it, this community of care that you're building? Thank you again for your wisdom and your experience. We really appreciate it, GJ. And he has a lot of experience also working with not only dementia personally, but also he's done programs for the dementia, the Alzheimer's Association. So would encourage you to learn more about him. And Theories of Care is the website, but he's here as a subject matter expert, which he certainly is. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us. We still have most of you still here with us. Take care of yourselves, and we will look to hook up again next month. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Betsy. I see you in the chat.